Hello everybody, welcome. We're here with Stephen Gilligan, leading teacher of Ericksonian hypnotherapy and developer of generative psychotherapy and one of the early developers of the field that we call NLP. Welcome Stephen, thank you.
Oh, thanks, great to be here.
We're going to talk about the new book edited by John Grinder and Frank Puslik, and you did a piece on it as well.
I did, yeah.
And we're going to talk about the early days in the history of NLP and what happened. So how did you get into NLP in the first moment?
Well, actually I talk about it in that chapter that I wrote, and this of course was 40 years ago.
Yes.
I never thought I'd be saying, wow, 40 years ago, but here we are. I was an undergraduate at Santa Cruz, at UC Santa Cruz, which was the home of NLP. I was undergraduate. I dropped out for a couple of quarters. I sort of hit my dark period as a 19-year-old of drug, sex, rock and roll, and my sort of Irish Catholic tradition. I went through a real crisis period, almost killed myself. And out of that, I got this sense that I really want to be on this path of going to school and being at Santa Cruz. So I went back, and I had to sign up for the courses, and I didn't know what to take. I didn't really have quite specific interests, and I looked in the course curriculum, and there was this one course called Stepstone Ecology of Mind by some guy named Gregory Bates, and I didn't know what the heck it meant, but it sounded interesting. So I said, okay, I'll sign up for that. And there was a second course called The Political Economy of the United States by some guy named John Grinder. And it was sort of a radical politics exhortation to overthrow the United States government by any means possible. And as a Santa Cruzer in the 1970s, it seemed like kind of a standard course to take. So I took that. It was at this point in my life that I was totally open. And I think whatever Providence just sort of guided me to have this connection. This was right at the time then when Grinder and Bandler started teaching together. And so I was in the first, what they call the meta model group. And it took off from there. And it just, it lit a fire in me. John Grinder was a professor at Santa Cruz. He was, we've got Frank Puslik sitting over there, and I was telling Frank the other day, John was the first university professor who totally took me seriously and communicated this message, as he did to many of his students. I see that you have something important to contribute. And so that, along with this very interesting space that was opening, got me into it, and I sort of consumed my life for the next 4 years.
Wow. And throughout the book there's a lot of talks about the practice groups and students coming together to practice.
Yeah.
Can you give us a taste of the atmosphere in those groups? How was it to just for hours practice on things that you had a feeling that might work, but how was that?
Well, I think time disappeared, so it wasn't like hours. I mean, it was just like a sense of waking up every morning with this sense of what can we learn today. And I think the question was not what would work, but what sort of interesting spaces of consciousness can we open.
Yeah.
So I don't think we were so much, I wasn't personally into this testing, but this exploration. And to me, that was the original spirit, was not so much what are the formal models, but in a very important sense, how can you burn through all models? And I think Bandler was especially amazing in that way. At that time, and I was a young university student, his exhortation was burn through all the maps. The maps are not the territory.
Yeah.
It became one of the sort of the battle cries of NLP. But I think Bandler really had that burning sense, It was immensely helpful. And as a student, it got me into the sense that the learning is not in the book. The learning is not in the reading of the maps, but the learning is through this connection into life and this curiosity about what's possible.
Yeah. So, in the book you write about the revolutionary spirit of NLP. It comes from a beautiful combination of learning without maps and learning via maps improved by meta-modeling principles.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's something that I still think is really crucial. That, I mean, you know, there's the notion that the map is not the territory, but there was often a sense that a corollary premise that we don't have access to the territory. And, you know, I have somewhat of a disagreement. I think we are the territory. You know, anything we say about it, anything we represent about it is just a map. But I think that we are consciousness itself, if you will, which is another way of talking about the territory. And so that really creative learning is this opening and burning through the maps, letting go of all your maps, which is to me what trance is. But then making sure that you have a way to map it, to represent it, so that this creative world, which is not without fixed forms, if you will, can actually make a difference and be realized in the classical world of everyday life.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that creativity is really this movement between, or standing in one foot in both worlds simultaneously.
And how did that, how do you say that, how did that come to life in those practice groups which you were talking about?
Well, I think I mentioned in the book, I mean, it was funny then, it was even funnier in retrospect. I mean, the groups that I was in originally was the development of the meta model. And so he took these young kids, and we were just in this feverish pitch, and we'd get in the group, and Bandler would say something like, "Who wants to make a change tonight?" There might be 12, 15, mostly UC students. And people would raise their hand, say maybe 4 people would be picked, and they would be asked to go sit in the back room. And then there would be one meta-model distinction presented, like challenging deletions. Yeah. You know, what specifically, and so then the 2 or 3 of the students would be sent into the room as therapists to just badger the hell out of the poor client with this one meta-model question. But it was an impassioned conversation. But it would invariably get to an impasse, and then it was sort of an interesting sort of drama. Usually the door would break open, and then Richard Bandler would be standing there like some Wild West, you know, gunslinger, and everybody would look at him, and he would come in and he would say, "What seems to be happening here?" And he would just do one little thing, and as I say in the book, I don't think we were consciously appreciative of the notion of response potential. It's like he could have done anything, you know, at that point, and there was this big shift. Yeah. And there, you know, it was an amazing time because people were really opening to these deep sort of transformational changes. And then after that, we'd get back into the group proper, the group as a whole. People would share what they did. And then usually Richard would go on a little rant, or a little rave, I should say, about psychotherapy and about the different models and about how they often had certain shortcomings and so forth. And I would walk out of there just buzzing. I mean, I had an interest in psychology for a long time, but what those groups did for me was they lit that interest on fire. Wow. And they really encouraged this notion that anything that you would want to know about psychology comes from the connection. Yeah. It's not from your theory. That the theory is at best a filter through which you can make a skilled connection.
Yeah.
But if you don't have the connection, then the theoretical map is actually going to work against whatever positive intention you might have.